After our performance of In the Heat of the Night in October 2014, journalist Todd Purdum spoke with LA Theatre Works' live in performance audience about the history of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In addition to his work as a senior writer at Politico and contributing editor to Vanity Fair, Purdum is the author of An Idea Whose Time Has Come: Two Presidents, Two Parties, and the Battle for the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Seeing this was very vivid because I have to confess I've never actually seen the movie with Rod Steiger and Sidney Poitier, and these actors were fantastic, so it was really uplifting. And for me, I spent so much of the past 3 years of my life researching this book, but the part of the story that I was focusing on really happens almost exclusively in Washington, in the halls of Congress. And when you see something as powerful as this, you realize why the people in Washington were finally moved to act 100 years after the Civil War, why they had to do something about it. And it was the violence on the streets of Birmingham in the spring of 1963 that finally persuaded John Kennedy he had to do something, and the something would have to be a strong new federal law, which is what the civil rights community had been pressing for, what the freedom riders and the demonstrators and Dr. King and the others had been wanting for years. Kennedy had campaigned on a really strong civil rights platform in 1960, and so had Richard Nixon. In fact, it seems impossible to believe, but the Republican and Democratic platforms in that year were almost identical on the question of civil rights. But once in office, he temporized and was afraid of alienating the Southern barons who ran both houses of Congress because he needed their support for everything else he wanted to do, including his central economic platform, the big tax cut. So the one thing that was lucky, the country was every bit as divided then as it is today, and as we can see from this play and from the pictures behind, in many ways more divided. It seemed like we really were on the verge of a second Civil War. And in fact, one of the ironies is nobody could figure out how to commemorate all these various Civil War events because it would just bring up what was going on in the streets of the current day. So on the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, for example, Kennedy didn't know what to do. So he didn't show up at the Lincoln Memorial. He just sent a recording, and he was at the America's Cup races off Newport. But he was irritated to find that Nelson Rockefeller did show up in person, and he brought with him New York State's personal copy of Lincoln's draft of the Emancipation Proclamation in his own hand, which had wound up in the New York State archives. So he realized he was under some pressure. So on Lincoln's birthday, 1963, he invited 850 leading black Americans to the White House, the largest single gathering of black people ever in the White House. And they were all told to come in through the back door, so no one would see them coming in. And Pierre Salinger told the white mainstream press that this was no big deal, but it made a huge splash in the black press. A couple of very important people boycotted, though, including Martin Luther King, because Kennedy had not proposed the bill. So when he finally did propose the bill in June of '63, it was a remarkable speech. It's one that he doesn't get enough credit for. It's one that's not remembered. But on the night of June 11th, he made this impassioned plea from the Oval Office on live television. He hadn't finished the speech fully when he started to give it. He ad-libbed the last 2.5 minutes, and it's when he said that this was a moral issue as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. And 4 hours later, in his driveway in Mississippi, Medgar Evers was shot dead. His wife and children had been up watching Kennedy's speech and were waiting for him to come home. So, against the backdrop of this tremendous violence and division in the country, the saving grace was that Washington was still a place that worked. And to an extraordinary degree that I had not understood, there were cross-partisan alliances that made the passage of this bill possible. And the Washington of then is so different from today. I think I'll take just a few moments to highlight a couple of the realities. It seems like another planet. First of all, the members really did know each other. They drove home to the districts with each other, even if they were of opposite parties. Their spouses and children knew each other, played sports, and went to school together. And it's easy to romanticize that and to overestimate its effect, but when you'd been to dinner in someone's home, it was much harder on the floor of the Senate or the House the next day to call him, a son of a bitch. And they had a basic threshold respect for each other. Many of them had shared experiences. The younger ones had been through World War II together. The older ones had remembered World War I and the Depression and had the common enemy of the Cold War. In fact, one of Kennedy's enormous concerns about civil rights was that the Soviets were having a field day with situations like happening in Argo. They thought, how can you preach democracy around the globe if you can't get your own house in order? So that's one thing. They fundamentally knew and respected each other. The second is that the realities of the country's politics meant that there were not really two parties in Washington, there were three. There were the Republicans and the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. And in fact, I didn't realize that's how Congressional Quarterly kept track of the votes on things involving civil rights, for example. They listed the votes three ways, DS and DN. and Republicans. So there not only was the possibility of cross-party alliances, there was the necessity. So many Democrats in the Senate, for example, 18, plus John Tower, the Republican of Texas, opposed any bill that they knew the only way that they could get to 67 votes and cut off debate, and it took 67 votes in those days, 2/3, was to get about 24 Republicans. And the Republicans at that point still took very seriously their legacy as the party of Lincoln, and it happened that with a lot of work and persuasion, those 24 votes were eventually available. So that's a structural difference. Another thing, and I don't mean to sound flip about it, but they all drank all day long and into the evening, and they drank during business hours and they drank after work. And I have to think that if it didn't improve their mood, at least it wore down their resistance, because Nick Katzenbach, the Deputy Attorney General, who was the point man on the whole bill for the Kennedys and then for President Johnson, told me just before he died that the challenge had been in dealing with Everett Dirksen, the Republican leader, in these late night sessions in his office, was to get a firm agreement on the changes that had been made before so much bourbon had been consumed that Dirksen wouldn't remember the next morning what he'd agreed to, because while they could change the language once without changing its meaning, they couldn't change the language twice without risking changing the substance of the bill, too. And the changes that Dirksen wanted, he was from Illinois, which already had strong anti-discrimination laws on the books, and in that classic Midwestern small-town conservative way, he didn't want the feds coming in and making double sets of records keeping for employment discrimination actions. He didn't want what he thought would be harassment from Washington. So they made a series of changes that let states like his, that had their laws on the books, get first crack before the federal government would weigh in, and that put things in the realm of the courts instead of administrative agencies like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And perversely, one of the effects that had by putting these disputes in the courts, the federal courts, is it gave rise, after the bill's passage, to an enormous wave of class action employment discrimination lawsuits, and because of the last-minute inclusion of women in the bill, gender discrimination lawsuits, that really revolutionized the workplace. And that had, in some ways, probably a much more powerful effect than a fledgling federal agency that had, limited enforcement power would have had. And finally, I found in doing my research that just as we must have been awfully lucky, and I think there is a luck in history, at the time of the founding to have this remarkable collection of people that we had, Washington, Adams, Franklin, Jefferson, and so on. 50 years ago, we were incredibly lucky to have a remarkable collection of people who really did do the right thing for the right reason. John Kennedy came to the cause reluctantly, but when he jumped in with everything he had, and so did his brother Robert. Lyndon Johnson's own journey on civil rights had been a slow one, but when he came to the cause, there was nobody stronger, and as he famously said in proposing the Voting Rights Act, we shall overcome. There were people, unsung heroes of both races and both parties that I had not really known of, but one of my favorite ones was this conservative congressman from west central Ohio named Bill McCulloch. His hometown of Piqua is represented today by John Boehner. Bill McCulloch opposed federal aid to education. He opposed foreign aid. He was rock-rib fiscal conservative. He never spent all his congressional office allowance because he thought it was wasteful. He turned it back in. But he was the descendant of abolitionists from before the Civil War, and he was a fierce supporter of civil rights. And in the summer of '63, when John Kennedy proposed the bill, McCulloch made a deal with the administration. He said, if you keep this strong bill all the way through the Senate and you don't make a compromise, I will back you to the hilt. But you have to do two things. You have to promise to give the Republicans equal credit going into the '64 election, which seems unthinkable. And you have to promise not to let the liberals in your own party run away with the bill and load it up with a bunch of things that can't pass. And that's what Kennedy agreed to do. That's what happened. It's ultimately what led to the strategy that forced them to break the filibuster in the Senate and get a strong bill through, which no one ever thought would be possible. No one really knows the name of Bill McCulloch today, but when he retired from Congress in 1972, he got an incredible letter written from aboard the yacht Christina in the Mediterranean. I know that you, more than anyone, were responsible for the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, Jacqueline Kennedy wrote. You made a personal commitment to President Kennedy in October 1963 against all the interests of your district. When he was gone, your personal integrity and character were such, and by the way, McCulloch's district had a population of 2.8% black. Your personal integrity and character were such that you held to that commitment despite enormous pressure and political temptations not to do so. There were so many opportunities to sabotage the bill without ever appearing to do so, but you never took them. On the contrary, you brought everyone else along with you. And as for my dear Jack, it is a precious thought to me that in the last month of his life, when he had so many problems that seemed insoluble, he had the shining gift of your nobility to give him the hope and faith he needed to carry on. May I thank you with all my heart, and may God bless you. It seems maybe an appropriate point to stop and take any questions, but it does seem like it was a different universe, and something like the power of drama tonight that we've seen, I think, probably does more to make us realize just what we faced, how far we've come, how far we still have to go. But thanks so much for having me again. I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Todd, where did you find Jackie's letter?
Mrs. Kennedy's letter is in Bill McCulloch's papers at Ohio State University, but I found it because a few years ago, a bunch of citizens in Ohio undertook a campaign to get a statue in Statuary Hall in honor of McCulloch, because one of the people representing Ohio there now is a former pro-Southern guy from the 1840s, so they thought it was about time they had some better representation. And it turns out that the McCulloch family had kept the letter for all these years and never really consulted it, and they found it in a safe deposit box, and it was put in circulation by these people who were running the campaign.
So I was just going to ask, other than bourbon, do you have any thoughts about the lessons from this that could be applied to how bills are passed today or impeded today?
Well, I think it's actually interesting to be here in California, because one of the things that's going to have to happen is the districting process is going to have to change. All the congressional districts now are redder and bluer, and there are no competitive districts anymore. I mean, the thing that you can't imagine is this bill passed the Senate 73 to 27. With 27 out of 33 Republicans voting yes. So I think districting could be one help. I think another thing that's terrible, frankly, I mean, the media doesn't help. These negotiations happened in secret. They fundamentally happened behind closed doors. Because the Senate Judiciary Committee under Jim Eastland of Mississippi, who was a vicious racist, wouldn't really seriously, they had hearings at which they tortured Robert Kennedy, but they were not going to move the bill to the floor. So the Senate was required to create a kind of an ad hoc committee of Justice Department aides, White House aides, Senate aides, and senators themselves who met day after day, and they could test their ideas with their opponents without being, embarrassed by the nightly news or without somebody trying to raise money by the weekend on the latest possible solution. And the fact that they were able to keep it all secret until it was soup was another big help. And I think if the press had been there, the press was very aggressively reporting on the story, and Roger Mudd of CBS was a true hero. He made something like 11 broadcasts every day during the filibuster. But fundamentally, we did not have the kind of 24/7 media we have now. There wasn't social media. There wasn't Facebook. People weren't, rising up in outrage at each possible compromise. They waited and then they heard. And it must be said that the pro-civil rights forces, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, Dr. King's group, other people, they were furious. They thought, why are you cooperating with Senator Dirksen? You're going to water down this bill. You're going to sell it short. And they were horrified at each step of the way. Their hair was on fire constantly, and you can see it in the transcripts of their meetings. And what they didn't understand was Hubert Humphrey, who was the floor manager for the Democrats, his strategy was let the Southerners talk themselves to death, and the energy would suddenly change in an almost jujitsu way, where suddenly they'd be on the defensive. They'd be the ones having to justify their obstructionism. And that's exactly what happened in the end. And they knew that they were fighting a losing battle. And for them, the fact that it went on so long allowed them to go home and say to their constituents, we fought and we lost fair and square, and now it's the law of the land and we all have to obey it.
So. There a lot of polling that went on during that?
A lot of polling. I don't think polling was, in general, nearly as sophisticated as now, and I didn't find much evidence of polling, although what did happen is, as the debate went on and after the March on Washington, by the time John Kennedy died, support for the bill was really quite strong. It was like 2/3 of the country thought it was time for the bill. When he proposed it, a big segment thought he was moving too quickly. And of course, then in the aftermath of the assassination, Johnson exploited that sense of grief and guilt to go forward. One interesting thing, though, is I forgot to mention, you might have suspected that the business community would have lobbied against this because they would have to, the big national drug chains and other things would have to. In fact, they stayed conspicuously silent, as if they wanted someone else to solve the problem for them. But the most crucial lobbying effort was undertaken by organized religious groups, interfaith groups of every stripe, and they concentrated their efforts on those states in the Midwest and Great Plains, particularly where there were Republican House and Senate members, who had no black constituencies, no labor or union or liberal constituencies, no instinctive reason to be in favor of civil rights. But they had a lot of Methodists and Catholics, and even in the urban centers, Jews, and they were sensitive and susceptible to an appeal from their religious leaders. And they lobbied incessantly. They knew which member was what denomination, so they'd have a Catholic bishop called the Catholic Jack Miller from Iowa. They'd have some Methodist called Carl Munt, who was from North Dakota. They knew that Mrs. Munt was a strong supporter of the bill. So every morning when the senator would leave for the office about 9 or 10, somebody from Hubert Humphrey's staff would call Mary Munt to give her talking points for the day, so that when he came home at night, she'd give it to him. And so that's the kind of micro-targeting. I mean, micro-targeting is not entirely a new phenomenon, and that's what they did in those days.
Can you talk a little bit about Johnson?
I think Johnson deserves all the credit he gets, but in some ways he gets credit for the wrong things. The record shows very clearly that he wasn't micromanaging the day-to-day process of the debate. He wasn't really twisting arms and getting in there and meddling because he knew that his former colleagues would resent him if he tried to do that. And he made, as Richard Nixon later did and as John Kennedy had also, all these secret recordings of conversations on the telephone and in the White House. And what those transcripts show is he was fit to be tied at the pace that Hubert Humphrey and Mike Mansfield, the majority leader in the Senate, were taking. He thought they should throw the Senate into round-the-clock sessions, put the screws to the anti-civil rights people, and he couldn't understand why they were letting it drag on. So I think one of the things that he should get credit for is restraining himself and knowing that he could not be too involved on a day-to-day basis or it would backfire. And the other thing is he never wavered in his public and private insistence that the bill be strong, that the bill not be watered down. He and Everett Dirksen, the Republican leader, had had a closer friendship and a friendly rivalry. In the mid-'50s, when Johnson was the majority leader and became the first person on Capitol Hill to get a car phone, Dirksen was upset. So he arranged to get his own car phone. And he called Johnson one day and said, "Lyndon, I'm calling you from the car." And Johnson said, "Hold on, Ev, my other line is ringing." So Dirksen went to the White House thinking he was going to get a deal. And Johnson sent him packing in under 20 minutes saying there's not going to be a deal. And that's when Dirksen fell to the fallback position of we've got to make 80-some changes in the wording that really didn't make any changes in the meaning and allowed him to say we've put our stamp on it when, in fact, they had largely danced around the edge and not changed that much. But one thing that Lyndon Johnson did was he was always calling even the opponents, not because he thought he could change their mind, but because he thought he'd get intelligence from them about what was on their minds and what they were thinking. And it's remarkable to see the way he was pumping his old friends, just like, what do you hear and what's going on? And, and cajoling them and trying to joke with them and say, maybe you'll support me on this. But he really was an intelligence gatherer, and he knew more, and he was a listener.
So assuming the time of this play is when it was written, 1965, after the Civil Rights Act was already passed, the situation where Tibbs is not allowed into the diner, is not allowed into the hotel in town, when did things start to really change on that score?
The play's set in 1962, right? Even though it was written in 65.
Okay.
But the answer is they started to change dramatically. President Johnson signed the bill on July 2nd, 1964, and John Lewis and other people have recalled that, like, instantaneously, things changed. There was a young Army captain just back from his first tour in Vietnam, and he was stationed in Georgia. And he had come back in the winter of 1964, and he was fixing up a house for his wife and young baby son, and he went to try to buy a hamburger at the local drive-in. And no one came out for a long time. Finally, a waitress came out and said, "Are you a Puerto Rican?" He said, "No." "Are you an African student?" "No." "Well, who are you?" "I'm an American Negro. I'm an Army officer." And she said, "Well, I'm from New Jersey, and I don't understand this at all, but I can't serve you. But if you come around to the back, I can pass a sack out to you." He went back to the same restaurant on the July 4th weekend of 1964 and was served without the slightest hesitation. His name was Colin Powell.
Okay, well,
Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much.
Todd. Thank you. That was great. Thanks very much.